Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to look at the crucial distinction between living from being and doing as it is understood in David R. Hawkins's works. These are fundamentally different states to live from. In his book Power versus Force, Hawkins describes two states, power and force. In power, you are living from being, while in force, you are living from doing. However, being and doing are much more than ways of interacting with our experiences. In fact, this distinction becomes a doorway to understanding life itself. Being is the state of pure awareness, the presence that remains when all effort to control is dropped. It is not something you achieve, because it is what you already are. Doing, on the other hand, is the constant activity of the ego, which believes it is the author of life and must work endlessly to secure outcomes. When you live from doing, life feels like a series of problems to solve, goals to chase, and identities to maintain. There is a sense of tension because doing comes from the belief that peace and happiness lie somewhere in the future, just beyond the next accomplishment. In doing, you are alone, cut off from everyone and everything else, trying to make your way in a hostile and incomprehensible world. In being, you live from your connection to a source infinitely greater than your little ego, a connection that you share with the world and every living being in it. Hawkins explains that being is the silent background from which all things arise. It does not strive, it does not calculate, and yet it is the source of the most harmonious action. When you rest in being, there is a natural intelligence at play. Life organizes itself without the need for control. Thoughts, emotions, and actions flow effortlessly, as though guided by a greater order, which they are. This is not a mystical idea, but an observation about how consciousness operates when it is not clouded by fear and desire. The ego thinks that without its effort, nothing would happen. But Hawkins points out that the universe itself functions perfectly without your interference. Your breathing, the beating of your heart, and the turning of the earth require no personal control. In the same way, action flows naturally from being when you allow yourself to align with it. In fact, breathing is a pathway into this state. In breath, voluntary action meets the letting go of control in a very tangible sense. If you are observant, you will notice that this pattern also applies to many other phenomena present in your everyday life, such as thoughts or work. There is a pattern to how human experience operates here. The breath is not a pathway because you focus on it, even if this can be helpful when you want to ground yourself in the present moment. No, here you instead learn to let go of the breath and truly allow it to move on its own. This is not something that you try or effort your way into. On the one hand, you may breathe a little too fast because it feels like you are getting too little air if you do not, or you hold it a little too long because you make it into an exercise, something to perform. If you try to force yourself to breathe naturally, it only becomes more unnatural. You have to experience this for yourself to understand the difference, and it may take some time to do so. But when you do, you will notice that the breath takes on a different quality. Your breath naturally sinks down to your belly and the lower part of the solar plexus. It will take on a sense of ease, and you will breathe just right without effort. In this way, your breath, something that is with you from the day you are born until the day you leave this world, helps show you exactly what being is all about. When life is lived from doing, there is always a sense of strain. Even when success is achieved, it is fleeting because the ego quickly finds another problem to solve or another goal to reach. Doing is linked to the belief in scarcity, the feeling that you must fight for what you have. It arises from lower levels of consciousness where fear, pride, and desire dominate. In these states, actions are reactive rather than creative. They are driven by the need to prove, to control, and to avoid loss. As mentioned in the beginning, Hawkins describes this as the energy of force, which requires constant input to maintain and inevitably leads to exhaustion. Doing is not wrong in itself, but when it is not grounded in being, it becomes a trap. Being operates differently. It is aligned with what Hawkins calls power, which does not need to be defended or asserted. Power flows effortlessly because it is rooted in truth. When you live from being, there is no need to push life into shape. Actions arise spontaneously and are often far more effective than anything the ego could have planned. They carry an ease and clarity that cannot be manufactured. This is why people sometimes describe moments of inspiration where everything seems to fall into place. These moments are glimpses of life lived from being. They show that the most meaningful actions do not come from effort, but from alignment. In other words, being arises spontaneously from time to time for most people. This is what happens when someone gets into a flow state. However, when you understand this state, you can cultivate it intentionally. But, as we have seen, trying to effort your way into this state does not work, as the effort itself is the very opposite of the state you are seeking. As touched upon a moment ago, Hawkins also points out that being and doing are not enemies. Doing is not to be rejected, but understood. When it arises from being, it is transformed. Actions become expressions of the state you are in. If you are resting in being, your doing reflects that peace. There is no conflict between the two, because doing is no longer a way to secure your worth or control outcomes. It becomes a natural movement of life itself. You still act and work. You still create. But the strain is gone. Life feels less like a battle and more like a dance. Letting go of the ego's need to control opens the way for a greater intelligence to work through you. The actions that flow from surrender are infinitely more skillful and effective than those born from struggle. They come without inner resistance, and because they are not rooted in fear, they do not create new conflicts. Surrender is not about giving up, but about giving over, allowing life to act through you rather than against you. Psychologically, this shift can be understood as moving from a reactive to a responsive state. When you are identified with the ego, every situation triggers patterns of reaction. These reactions are based on past conditioning and are often accompanied by anxiety or anger. They consume energy because they are attempts to control what cannot be controlled. In the state of being, there is space around events. You do not react, you respond. This response arises from a calm presence that sees more clearly and acts more wisely. This clarity is not a product of effort, but of the absence of internal noise. If you are observant, you can see that this is where you find true freedom. By definition, reactivity can never be free. In reactivity, one is a helpless slave to the past, bound to live out pre-programmed patterns and never making any truly free choices. On the other hand, whether you recognize it or not, every time you make a truly free choice, you temporarily move from doing into being. But it is easy to confuse the two, and now we are cultivating the latter intentionally. Hawkins' map of consciousness shows how this transition unfolds through distinct states that shape how life is experienced. At the lowest levels, such as shame, guilt, and apathy, doing is driven by fear and hopelessness. Actions at these stages often feel forced or absent altogether, as energy is consumed by survival and self-protection. Moving slightly higher, through grief and fear, doing still dominates, but there is at least movement, even if guided by anxiety or avoidance. Desire and anger bring more energy, yet actions here remain reactive, fueled by craving and opposition. As awareness rises to courage, there is a pivotal shift. This is also the breaking point where conscious action starts to replace reactivity. One begins to see that fear does not have to dictate every choice, and doing starts to lose its compulsive quality. At neutrality, actions become less charged because the need to control or resist eases, creating space for more balanced responses. With willingness, doing is energized by optimism and openness, allowing actions to become constructive rather than defensive. Acceptance deepens this transformation. Life is no longer viewed as an adversary, and there is a growing ability to work with situations rather than against them. At reason, clarity informs action, but it is still shaped by thought and effort. Beyond this, at love and joy, action flows so naturally from being that the distinction between doing and being fades. There is no sense of separation between the one who acts and the action itself. At peace and enlightenment, doing as a separate activity dissolves entirely because life expresses itself directly through the state of being. What remains is a seamless expression of consciousness, where every action arises spontaneously as part of the whole. Living from being does not mean withdrawing from the world. Hawkins was clear that this state is not about sitting in silence forever, although silence is often part of the path. It is about carrying that awareness into every aspect of life. Work still happens, relationships continue, challenges arise, but they are met from a different place. When you are grounded in being, the challenges of life do not overwhelm you because they do not define you. You see them as passing events in a field of awareness that is untouched. From this perspective, actions are taken with less fear and more clarity, and they often bring better results. The ego resists this way of living because it thrives on doing. It believes that without effort and control, everything will fall apart. Yet the more one surrenders to being, the more one sees that the opposite is true. Life flows with a rhythm that does not need to be managed. When you stop interfering, things often fall into place on their own. This is not to say that difficulties disappear, but your relationship with them changes. They are no longer battles to win, but experiences to meet. In this meeting, action arises naturally, and it is often far more effective than the ego's frantic attempts to solve everything. As touched upon in the beginning, the difference between living from being and living from doing is ultimately a difference in identity. When you live from doing, you identify with the small self that is separate, vulnerable, and always trying to control. When you live from being, you identify with the awareness that is beyond all forms. This awareness is not threatened by life's ups and downs, and so it does not act out of fear. It acts because action is what arises in the moment. In this way, life becomes a continuous unfolding rather than a series of struggles. Hawkins's teachings invite you to experiment with this shift. It is not something to believe, but to experience. The next time you feel compelled to act from fear or pressure, pause and sense the presence that is already here. From that stillness, see what action arises. Often it will be different from what you expected, and it will come with an ease that surprises you. In other words, being is closely related to your intuition. What you are experiencing is the flow of being expressing itself through doing. Over time, as this way of living deepens, the line between being and doing dissolves. Life is no longer divided into inner and outer, effort and result. It is simply lived, and in that living, peace and action are one. The difference between being and doing is therefore not just an idea to consider. It is a lived reality that transforms how you experience yourself and the world. To live from being is to discover that life does not need to be conquered, it needs to be allowed. In that allowing, you find that everything you were striving for was present all along, quietly waiting for you to stop trying so hard to find it. In summary, David R. Hawkins shows that the difference between being and doing is not theoretical, but deeply practical. Doing, when driven by the ego, is reactive, exhausting, and rooted in fear and control. It dominates at lower levels of consciousness, where actions serve survival and defense rather than growth. As awareness rises through the map of consciousness, the compulsive quality of doing fades. At courage and beyond, action becomes less about avoiding fear and more about responding with clarity. When you reach acceptance, reason, and eventually love, doing is no longer separate from being. It becomes its expression. At the highest levels, peace and enlightenment, there is no division at all. Life acts through you effortlessly. To live from being is to allow this natural intelligence to move without interference, making life not something to control, but something to live fully, with ease and presence. In essence, moving from doing to being is to bring yourself back to the present moment and away from the mind's automatic tendency to project itself into the future or use past experiences to define what the present moment means. It means allowing yourself to be present with your immediate experience, not in a forceful way, but because it is a state that is just as natural to you as the absent state that you have unconsciously practiced for most of your life. When you anchor yourself in the present moment, you will notice that you feel calm, grounded, and open. The more you make this shift, the more powerful this experience will be, and the easier it will be to recognize it. It is important to understand that you are always living in one state or the other. Are you present with what you are doing, or do you feel an urge to get it done? Are things flowing, or are you straining? What energy do your words carry? Are they calm and grounded, or do they contain a subtle background noise of irritation, frustration, fear, or a general wish for things to be different from what they are? It is important to recognize that this is not about making anything in your experience wrong. On the contrary, your experience is simply an indication of what state you are in. And if you try to move into being by changing your experience, you are missing the point. You shift it by accepting everything that is there, because it is there whether you meet it with openness or resistance. From this place, you move quietly away from the noisy world of the doer into the quiet, observing place of being. If you want to learn more about Hawkins's works, there is a playlist with different videos about them available right now, together with a video that explains the distinction between power and force, and another video about the spiritual teacher Osho's distinction between activity and conscious action, which will further help elucidate what is taught in this video. All of this relates to the same inner shift that everyone is eventually destined for, in this lifetime or another, and seeing it from different angles helps deepen our understanding. You've now reached the end of the video. Remember to like and subscribe, and check out the description and comment section to see other things that we do. Thank you for your time.